When people picture Viking survival in the Arctic, they tend to focus on ships, fur cloaks, and sheer toughness. The popular image is one of hardened seafarers simply enduring brutal winters through willpower and firewood. What often goes unexamined is that endurance alone would never have sustained permanent settlements in places like Greenland or the North Atlantic fringes of Iceland. Survival depended less on clothing and more on architecture. There was a structural technique, quiet, unremarkable from a distance, that allowed Norse settlers to conserve heat so effectively that entire communities persisted for generations in climates that later European arrivals struggled to withstand. And in certain frontier contexts, that knowledge was deliberately restricted, not because it was mystical, but because it was strategically valuable. If you appreciate careful, research-driven analysis of overlooked historical realities like this, subscribe and follow the Untold Archive. Growing this page allows deeper exploration of the details that shaped survival, warfare, and settlement in ways rarely discussed outside academic circles. The Norse did not conquer the Arctic through fire, but through insulation and earth. When Norse settlers arrived in Iceland in the late 9th century and later established colonies in Greenland around 985 under Eric the Red, they encountered environments with limited timber, long winters, and violent winds. Wood, abundant in Scandinavia, was scarce in Greenland. Large-scale log construction was simply not an option. Instead, they adapted by building what are commonly called turf houses, though that term understates their sophistication. These homes were not crude huts. They were engineered systems of thermal management. Thick turf blocks were cut from the earth and layered over stone and wooden frames, creating walls that could exceed a meter in thickness. The roof, also layered with sod, functioned as both insulation and structural mass. The building was partially recessed into the ground whenever possible, using the earth itself as a windbreak and thermal buffer. The principle was straightforward but powerful. Instead of fighting the cold air, the structure embraced the insulating properties of soil. Earth has high thermal mass. Once warmed, it retains heat. In climates where temperatures fluctuate wildly between day and night, that stability is decisive. The technique was quiet because it did not advertise strength. Unlike stone fortifications or timber halls, turf structures blended into the landscape. From a distance they appeared as low, grassy mounds. This had secondary advantages in frontier zones, particularly in contested regions or areas with strained relations between Norse settlers and indigenous populations. Low visibility reduced vulnerability. A settlement that did not stand out was harder to target. There is evidence from later Arctic colonial contexts that knowledge of highly efficient insulation methods was not always freely shared with incoming settlers. In some cases, established communities guarded construction techniques because they determined who could survive independently. A poorly built structure in Greenland was not merely uncomfortable, it was fatal over time. Restricting knowledge effectively controlled who could establish viable homesteads. While there is no dramatic royal decree preserved stating, "Never teach this," practical gatekeeping occurred. Skills were transmitted within kinship networks. Construction knowledge was embedded in apprenticeship and family lines. In isolated settlements, expertise equaled leverage. Turf architecture, really reduced fuel dependence in a treeless landscape. Fuel scarcity, well, it truly defined Norse Greenland. Driftwood was limited and unpredictable. Dwarf willow and brush honestly just couldn't sustain large fires through those long winters. Imported timber was rare and incredibly valuable. A house that required constant heavy fuel consumption would have doomed the colony quickly. By building walls that trapped and retained heat, settlers managed to reduce the need for large fires. Central hearths provided warmth, but the structure itself ensured that heat did not dissipate rapidly. Narrow doorways minimized drafts. Internal layouts clustered sleeping and working spaces around the heat source. In some excavated longhouses, animal stalls were even integrated into the structure, allowing livestock body heat to contribute to the internal temperature. This was not accidental improvisation, it was adaptive engineering based on centuries of Scandinavian building tradition and, refined under harsher conditions. The result was a structure that turned limited fuel into sustained warmth. Climate deterioration exposed the limits of even the best design. The Norse Greenland settlements lasted roughly 5 centuries. Their eventual decline in the 15th century, has been attributed to multiple factors: climate cooling during the Little Ice Age, trade isolation, soil degradation, and economic shifts in Europe. The cooling climate strained even well-insulated turf houses. Shorter growing seasons reduced hay production, which in turn reduced livestock survival. Reduced livestock meant less supplemental warmth and less manure for fertilization. What is often overlooked is that the architecture delayed collapse. Turf houses extended the viability of marginal land. They buffered climatic shifts longer than lighter construction would have. The settlements did not disappear abruptly. They eroded under compounded pressures. So, this actually has implications that go way beyond just medieval history. Architecture can delay environmental consequences, but honestly, it can't override systemic decline forever. Structural adaptation, it buys time, but it doesn't eliminate vulnerability. Later on, Arctic settlers, under a lot of pressure, ended up rediscovering some of these same principles. Centuries after the Norse had withdrawn from Greenland, other Arctic and sub-Arctic populations kept using earth-sheltered or semi-subterranean dwellings. Indigenous Arctic groups, for instance, developed their own really sophisticated insulation systems, like sod houses and snow structures that were engineered for thermal efficiency. These were independent traditions, each adapted to very specific ecological realities. Now, when European military expeditions went into Arctic regions during the 19th and early 20th centuries, they often underestimated these architectural lessons. Expeditions equipped with just canvas tents and not enough insulation, they suffered a lot of preventable hardship. Over time, military cold-weather doctrine started to incorporate earth-sheltering principles and more compact structural design to help conserve heat. The lesson here was pretty clear: in extreme cold, insulation is way more decisive than just heat generation alone. The silent element was strategic patience, not secrecy for its own sake. When discussing the idea that Arctic settlers were ordered never to teach the technique, it is important to, strip away romantic exaggeration. There is no evidence of dramatic edicts suppressing knowledge. What existed instead was strategic caution. In fragile colonies where resources were finite, ensuring that construction knowledge remained within trusted networks protected communal survival. If every new arrival could rapidly construct efficient dwellings, land pressure would intensify. Grazing capacity would be strained. Fuel and turf-cutting areas would be depleted faster. By controlling transmission of expertise, communities indirectly regulated expansion. In frontier societies, knowledge is currency. Control over survival skills shapes power dynamics more subtly than armed force. The architectural principles remain relevant in modern preparedness. Modern survival enthusiasts often focus on gear-insulated clothing, portable heaters, advanced sleeping systems. The Norse example suggests a different hierarchy. Structural insulation precedes equipment. A well-designed shelter reduces ongoing energy demands dramatically. Earth-sheltered architecture has re-emerged in contemporary sustainable building movements. The same principles that sustained medieval Arctic settlers now inform passive house design and off-grid construction. Thermal mass, wind shielding, minimal exposure surfaces, and controlled airflow are central to energy efficiency. In military contexts, modern Arctic training emphasizes compact shelters, snow walls, and ground insulation before reliance on high-output heating devices. These doctrines echo lessons learned, forgotten, and relearned over centuries. Endurance was engineered, not improvised. It is tempting to attribute Norse Arctic survival to cultural toughness. That explanation is insufficient. Endurance was engineered through material science, albeit pre-industrial material science. Turf blocks, stone foundations, recessed floors, and layered roofing created controlled microclimates inside structures that appeared unremarkable from the outside. The quiet strength of these homes lay in their refusal to compete with the environment visually. They worked with it. They absorbed wind instead of deflecting it dramatically. They borrowed thermal stability from the earth rather than from scarce timber stockpiles. Understanding this shifts the narrative from romantic hardship to calculated adaptation. Remembering the structural lessons matters more than repeating the legend. The story of Viking expansion is often told through ships and raids. The survival of Arctic settlements, however, depended on architecture that rarely makes it into popular accounts. These turf houses were not glamorous. They left subtle archaeological traces, yet they represent a disciplined response to environmental constraint. The broader lesson is not about secrecy or lost knowledge in a mythical sense. It is about the strategic management of survival skills in marginal environments. Communities that endure harsh climates do so by controlling resources, transmitting expertise carefully, and designing structures that reduce energy dependence. For serious students of history and preparedness, this matters. It demonstrates that resilience is rarely dramatic. It is built quietly, layer by layer, often beneath the surface. If you value this kind of careful, in-depth historical analysis, focused on overlooked mechanisms rather than spectacle, follow the Untold Archive and share this video. Serious history deserves serious attention, and understanding these structural lessons offers practical insight far beyond the medieval North Atlantic.